Hello, welcome to Level 4 Health and Social Care, Unit 406, Sociology, Concepts in Health and Ill Health. And part 1 is looking at the theoretical perspectives. So the objectives of part 1, we're going to look at two criteria particularly in this section. We're going to look at describe the two theoretical perspectives to health and illness, and 1.2 describe Parsons' sick role. Okay, the sociological terms. So why is it sociology? What is sociology? Sociology is a scientific approach to understanding people in society. And it identifies the fact that social structures can actually exert more influence over our behaviour than maybe we realise sometimes. So what sociology does is it studies these different structures and studies the amount of influence it has on our behaviour. And this unit is focusing on health. And the point really is that we know now, those of us who've done level 3, talked about person-centered care, that it's just more than just the healthcare that you deliver. And it's important to understand the social aspects of health and of the world and how they have an effect on people's health and illness. Sociological theories are a way of speaking. I mean, they're taking away from just our common sense understanding and basing them in academic theory, which we can apply in our assignments. And we can quote some of the research as well. So it's concerned with the study of society. That's the whole point about sociology. And it specifically looks at changes in society and attempts to explain those changes. And one of its very big focuses is the distribution of power in different social groups. So power and influence, really. And it might be different classes, different races. It might be economic, social groups. It will look at all those sorts of aspects, look at the power imbalances, and maybe talk about the effect that they have on society. Sociology is considered a scientific discipline. It has very specific methods of investigation, not unlike the other sciences. It's based on that approach, and so it creates theories and attempts through experimentation and research to sort of prove or disprove those theories. And this section that we're going to look at in this PowerPoint really looks at a range of sociological perspectives. Now, for your assignment, you just need to talk about two. Today I'm going to talk about 4 different perspectives, which gives you a choice of which 2 you would like to write about. So you may find one a bit more interesting than another, so you can choose 2 out of 4 to write about. Now, the first sociological perspective, and probably one of the most well-known ones really, is something known as functionalism. And it's a sort of based on analogy of society like a biological organism, so like the human body, if you can imagine it. And the body is made up of, as we know, different organs which support each other. They're interrelated, and like without one you can't have the other. So if you take your heart away, the rest of the body wouldn't work. You take your brain away, you wouldn't be able to breathe and you wouldn't be able to think. So they're all interrelated. And although we can lose a few bits of our bodies, our appendices, appendix, and maybe our spleen, generally we need different parts of the body to help the guts work and to help everything work. And again, as I said, the brain and the heart are the most important parts of them. And these different parts achieve a unity. So in biological terms, that would be homeostasis. but in sociological terms, it's about a unity, and it's about a whole that functions. So they reflected that society is the same as the human body. There's lots of little parts that are all interrelated and that rely on each other to function in the whole. So functionalism is really not so concerned with an individual and what their aims and beliefs are. It's really more concerned with about how we all work together to maintain society as a whole, really. So it's looking at it as a whole systems approach, really. You might call it a whole systems approach. So an essential element into making sure that these systems are maintained is to look at the cultural subsystem and to make sure that everybody is motivated and working in the same way. And to do that, society identifies values. You know, the society you live in has sets of values that you live by. And if you are all living by those values, that's how you all tend to work together. And without this sort of value system, society wouldn't really function, because people would be all going off doing their own thing. But it's these group values that keeps a society cohesive. So if you talk with your friends about your shared values, which usually are very similar within peer groups, friendship groups, and the culture that you live within, as we've talked about that a little bit before, which it helps you to work together to keep that society and culture going. And within, as in the human body, within functionalism, the view is everybody's got their own role to do, and within that role, there's a certain set of expectations about how they're going to behave, how they're going to respond to various different things. And these expectations are known as role relationships. And again, carrying out these roles in the sort of expected way enables society to sort of go forward in in continuity, really. So again, it's the same as the human body. Your stomach does its job, your lungs does its job, your brain does its job. If one of them starts not doing what we expect it to, that's illness really occurs. So that means that the whole is not functioning. So in relation, so focusing our sociology here on health and illness, Tolcott Parsons identified the concept of the sick role. And he wrote about the sick role in 1951, so it was quite a long time ago. But to be honest, this view of the sick role remains with us and hasn't really changed that much. And it still gives us some useful insights into sickness. I mean, first of all, he sort of looked at sickness as a social role, not just a biological issue. So not just that there was bits in your body that weren't working and you were ill, or you had a bad back and through an injury or something like that. But also there's a social aspect to that role. And for societies to keep working well, sickness needs to be managed. So if the whole of the country was sick, there would be a problem. So in the sense that there's an expectation of, once you're not sick anymore, you come back and join into society. And we need to identify that people need to, we need to know whether people are sick or they're not, and when are they going to pick up their normal roles again. So the sick role is based on that assumption. If too many people described themselves as sick and basically didn't go to work, then this would be dysfunctional and it would be quite disruptive society. So if tomorrow everybody said, I don't feel well, I'm not going to work, things would become quite disrupted. And those who are able to make those judgments about whether people are sick or not is generally the medical profession, and they work within their boundaries, and they sort of basically say yay or nay, yeah, you're sick, or no, you're not. And really the only people we believe are sick are the ones that the doctor says are sick, really. So, I could wander around saying to you, oh, I think I've got malaria. But quite honestly, you'll people say, yeah, we'll go to the doctor then and get it confirmed. And that's the sort of standard sort of belief, and it's part of the role of the medical profession to, to confirm these issues, really. Uh, Originally, to give them the medication or to take the intervention to make someone weller again. So they have a role to start the ball rolling to actually get someone back to work or back to being part of society. So there's a very clear sort of view that unless you're a retired person, you're only temporarily excused from your normal obligations of, going to your job on Monday morning. And then only if you sort of, comply with the rules of sick role by, if you're told that you're to stay at home in bed, that you do stay at home in bed. Otherwise, people will say, well, he can't be that sick then if he's wandering about doing the garden or something. Now, we do know that obviously there are some illnesses that are bit less simple, and that people can be weller and some days and iller on other days, but that is still within the knowledge of the medical profession, really. So, so people can take on the sick role if they agree to comply with the regime. So, they take their medicine, they do what the doctor tells them, and then the idea is that they want to get well as soon as possible. And when that person takes on the sick role, be it for a week or for 6 months, they are excused for their normal roles and responsibilities in society. So people, in a way, don't expect them to take as much responsibility in society as they do when they're well. So, as I said, the medical profession determines who is legitimately sick, and that's why, in most countries, if you're ill for a certain time, you need to get a doctor's note to give to your employer. Otherwise, they'll just treat you as being absent and not as being sick. And so you could also say that the doctors have a regulatory role. They have to decide who they're going to sign off and who they don't. And there's an expectation that, they just don't do it willy-nilly to anybody because they have this responsibility to keep people working. This is a sort of consensual approach. It's something people are in agreement with and they accept it as part of most of society's rules. However, there has been some criticism of it, particularly in relation to the sick role. It's suggested that Talcott Parsons didn't really think about there might be some conflicts between you and your doctor. You might have disagreements. And he did all of his research with the assumption that doctors always act in the best interests of their patients, not always, because they might have some other objective, and very often, more often than not, they probably do. But what he didn't take it into any account that some doctors like some of their patients more than others and might give them a bit more time off or a bit more leeway, so we don't know how even-handed the doctor is. The main criticism is it's an unproven assumption, with the assumption that everybody understands with the sick role and agrees with it. And I think that may well have been so in the 50s when Parsons came out with the idea, but it's quite possible that nowadays people don't believe. They may, we can't really evidence that people all agree that it's up to a doctor to tell us when we're unwell or not. People are much more taking responsibility for their own bodies, making their own decisions, to the point that you're actually allowed to have so many. In the UK, you're allowed to have so many days off work without a doctor's note. So there was a time in the 50s when every day you had to have a doctor's note. Now you're allowed to make those decisions for yourself. It's only if you're going to be off for long term do you need a doctor's note. But you know, not everybody goes to doctors. Some people use alternative medicines, and they don't see doctors as the only person who can decide whether they're well enough or not. So research hasn't really happened recently to find out about what people's attitudes are and whether people believe so firmly in the sick role. Okay, so that was functionalism. The second perspective that we're looking at is something called symbolic interactionism. And it's based on the premise there's quite a big difference between what sociology looks at and what the natural science looks at. Whereas the functionalist approach sort of links in with the biological approaches, saying that yes, you know, just like in biology, society is built up of different organisms in that way. So while the study of the natural world deals with physical issues, the subject matter here of sociology consists of people whose actions are motivated by human consciousness. So really, symbolic interactionism is about how people see and understand the social world. So whereas functionalism was about the larger system, symbolic interactionalism is about the individual, and it's looking about what the individual thinks is right, wrong, okay, not okay, really, not what the group thinks. So significance of symbolic interactionism. So when we're looking at health behavior, it can sometimes be looking at something that could be quite irrational. For example, a piece of research, Heffler and Carter, looked at some young people in Australia, late teens really, who have been marginalised on account of their ethnicity, social class, sexuality, or gender identification. So in Australia, they were probably maybe young male indigenous population, the Aboriginal population, poor or working class, and they were sort of marginalized or not, you know, not being part of society because people had made assumptions about them, really. And they found that one of the things that you know gave them a shared identity, this sort of young group, was smoking. So they all smoked. It was a sort of a thing that brought them together, and it helped them sort of deal with issues, really. So it became part of their shared identity. So going off and sort of having a smoke somewhere, you know, it's how they were brought together. So by understanding that smoking was actually a symbol of their identity, it wasn't just a thing that one person did. It was something that brought them together. It could have been smoking, it could have been taking a certain drug, but either way, it's part of their group identity. Some sort of deviance in that respect. They said that if they did create any smoking cessation programs, then they need to be aware of how symbolic the role of smoking was, and that they might have to start dealing with some of the wider, more complex problems before people are going to give up smoking, because it's sort of a symbol of their feelings about society. It wasn't just as simple as having a cigarette. It was more about what is that cigarette conveying. You know, it's a way of saying, I don't care what you think of me. I don't, you know, I'm going to do these things you disapprove of. So they wouldn't just necessarily be easy to give up smoking, because it's about, you know, changing their identity and their group identity, which for some of these young marginalized groups is all they had, really. So if they were in a gang, for instance, the gang was there as a support network. Maybe they had bad family, bad home life, you know, poverty, deprivation. They may well join the gang for security. and that gang smoked as a sort of symbol of doing things that other people didn't like them to do. In a way, it's a way of showing they were sort of kicking back against. So the interactivist tradition really looks at the sort of nature of meaning, questioning some of the things that are taken for granted, like why do they smoke? Is it smoke that they just smoke because they feel like it, or is it, you know, has it got more of a meaning than that? So looking for what the meanings are and what might even be some simple behaviours, really. So an overview of the research is based on the approach does give you an idea of some of the strengths and weaknesses of symbolic interaction. Looking at the strength of symbolic interaction, Becker had a fairly famous analysis about deviance, which again focused very much on sort of young people's behaviour. And Becker sort of offered a definition of deviance. He said that it doesn't assume that, you know, people aren't deviant all the time. So what is described as deviant can change. So maybe in the 1950s, a certain behaviour would be considered deviant. In the 2000s, it would be something that's accepted now. So if you go back to the 50s and the 60s, gay and lesbian, homosexual relationships were considered very deviant and not accepted, in fact illegal in a lot of countries. So that would be considered deviant behaviour, and it had to be hidden away. Whereas in the 2000s, it's very open, it is no longer illegal, it's considered as acceptable, it's okay for people to have different relationships. So you've got something that has moved with history as well. So Becker felt that deviant behaviour can change with society's views and values changing, really. And also he identified, which is very important, that different cultures don't always have the same definition of what's deviant. So what may be deviant in the United States may not be considered deviant behaviour in Papua New Guinea. So going back to LGBTQ views, it would not be considered deviant in the US or the UK or anywhere in Europe, where it might be considered in Saudi Arabia or Iran to be extremely different, extremely deviant, and punished with the full force of the law. So different cultures. He was the guy who identified that different cultures had different ideas of what deviant was, and it really depended on the values of their society. So they can differ from one country to another. His research tended to concentrate on certain types of deviant behaviour, such as drug use and prostitution. And he sort of identified that this was a sort of process that led to individuals taking on deviant careers, therefore often getting involved in criminality, really, because both of those, illicit drug use and prostitution, were both considered illegal acts at the time. And his research identified that people who started off with sort of one deviant behaviour ended up with others because they got involved with the criminal system and broke the law in other areas from that. So that was some of the strengths of symbolic interactionalists like Becker, who looked at deviance. Looking now at the weaknesses of symbolic interaction, we can still focus on Becker's research on deviance, but identify where the sort of gaps were, which in fact identified the weaknesses. So he concentrated less on the structural factors that might help explain crime and deviance. He didn't really talk about big society. So he didn't identify such things as poverty, which might feed crime and deviance. And he didn't place a lot of emphasis on the source of power of the agencies who labelled people. So, like the criminal justice system, which is basically the government and the power of that government to make these labels. Really, he didn't really look at that at all. So he just really focused in the people's behaviour. He talked about moral entrepreneurs as influential shapers of public models, but he didn't really talk about who they were and, you know, where in the social context they lay. So he didn't look at the big picture of society. As I said, he focused more on individuals. And of course, individuals could well have been reacting to the way society was treating them in general. So in this context, we had the micro and macro elements of society, and micro is really looking at, very individual human behavior. Why did that individual embark on that criminal activity? The macro refers to the values and large structure of society, where someone who's interested in the macro might say, well, let's find out why society had such an effect on that individual that he did that. Okay. So in terms of criminal activities, that might involve the analysis of the economic circumstances. Did they steal because they had nothing, because they had no food? Or is it the process of lawmaking that doesn't take the working classes into account? Those sorts of things. So in that sense, they identified that although there were some strengths in symbolic interactionism, there were weaknesses. There were areas that weren't looked at. And Becker's deviance work gives you quite a good idea of that, Becker being one of the big symbolic interactionists. Okay, the third perspective that we're looking at is Marx, Karl Marx. A lot of you have probably heard of him because of the Communist Manifesto. And he really didn't set out to be a sociologist, but he sort of ended up being one along the way in that sense. What some might call him a political historian, some might call him a philosopher. There's lots of different ways of looking at it. But so his drive was very political. So in that sense, he looked at the study of society in quite a political way. It's really in the political radicalization in the 1960s. Marx was around much earlier than that, but people started picking up his ideas and they became part of the sociological mainstream. And he does give a good insight into the structure of society. Marx's view is very much focused around economic structure. He says the economic structure of any society determines what the social relationships will be like in that society. And he talked about, as some of you may know, some of the background to Marx, the distribution of ownership, where he said the means of production gave rise to the different class relationships, upper class, middle class, working class. And he identified that, there were inequalities of power between these three classes. And that's probably one of the most important things that Marx created that we've worked with in sociology ever since, really. He described most modern societies, first world societies, as capitalist. And that's to say divided between those who privately own the means of production, who are the minority, and those who are dependent on selling their labour to make a living, who are the majority. So in other words, the minority of people have the most money, basically, and the majority of people have the least money and have to rely on people buying their labour, work, paid work. And this sort of quite a classic division that you can cross many societies, when they all develop societies. And he identified these two classes as the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. The bourgeoisie, the rich capitalist owners, and the proletariat, the workers, really. And the relationship between the two is unequal, as we probably know, primarily in the relations of production, and very much the workers tend to be exploited for the needs of the owners. And that's how he felt it was. I think there's a lot of people who agree with some of that, simple as it is. Yule did some research with British social workers, trying to look at it in a health and social care phase. How can we use Marxism? How can we apply this theory to our work in health and social care? And he says their experience of alienation includes one way that capitalism can affect the physical health and emotional well-being of work. So his Marxist theory of capitalism said, that the working people were alienated. In other words, their opinions weren't asked for. They weren't involved with the development of things. They had no control over what they do. They just, they were just paid to do a job. And they weren't be able to different levels. They were unable to organize, plan, and carry out a job. They just had to follow the rules, really. As a result, according to Marx, work would become an activity that's boring, repetitive, draining, and not enabling people to have a form of self-actualization. If you remember Maslow's triangle from level 3, not really letting people get much further than halfway up, because they have no control over the decisions that happen. So they work for big companies and they just do what they're told, really. And even in the profession of social work, Yule identified, and this is 2018 research, so it's fairly recent, identified that social workers who had actually joined the profession to do, to feel what he called their compassionate self, and this is a form of self-actualization, to fulfill a lifelong desire to work with people who are, less well off than themselves or less able than themselves, and improve their lives. And they found out that, as time went by, that instead of actually being that compassionate self that they really wanted to develop, they just became, one of the phrases they used was disappointed jugglers, really. And he says that their working days and nights were filled with not actually doing any real helping of others, but completing lots of forms and balancing budgetary and time demands. Now, having led a team of social workers for a good few years for a local authority, I can honestly say this was true. And certainly in the late 2000s, having to, fill the amount of forms and finance management that we were doing, it allowed us very little time to spend that extra bit of time with people. We were just sort of fulfilling their most direct and basic needs, but their needs to actually talk to someone and help them with their personal development, help them move on to another stage, there was very little time to do that, really. We were just doing what needed to be done in that sense. And he identified that the social workers in study, because they had very little control over their work, and it was really not the job that they'd imagined, many developed quite poor well-being. They took a lot of time off because they just couldn't deal with the gap between what they thought the job was going to be and what the mundane, rigid, repetitive job it was turning out to be. And I know that I had a lot of people went off with stress, and we newly qualified social workers who come in sort of with bright ideas and really looking forward to their job, within a year or two became sort of fairly burnt out and cynical. And a lot of them left the profession quite quickly. So I can sort of back up. I can't show you any research, but Yule did the research. So looking at that sort of confirmed really the sort of things that Marx was saying, was when people don't have enough say in it and it just happens to them, that they can't get any fulfilling, like there is no job satisfaction. They're just sort of working for the man, as somebody says, you know. Some other research, Scrambler found that Marx's analysis of capitalism provided insights into the deeper mechanisms of why health inequalities are ubiquitous. Now, Marx, one of the issues about Marx was always about equality, because he believed, you know, that the state sort of fell into the two and there was a massive difference between the two, that naturally there would always be inequality. So Marx's view was all capitalist societies would have inequality because the power was unequally balanced. So 2009, Scrambler just did some more research on it, but it was really consolidating the sort of things that Marx was saying. He also contended that his heart capitalism is based on inequality of power. And the elite is quite a small group. They have to be a small group. It's easier that way, so they can, you know, communicate. If it gets too big, you get too many different ideas. This power allows elitist capitalist groups to shape policy. Remember, a lot of these elitist groups went on to be very important in our political systems. They were the independently, privately educated more often than not. If you have a look at the education of most of our MPs, they come from a very narrow background, really wealthy parents, able to send them to the best universities, studying certain subjects, which, you know, like PPE, politics, philosophy, and economics. And some one consequences is an increasing exploitation of the working class, alongside a reduction of the assets required. So the view was that, you know, the working class suffer at the hands of the rich. I'm sure everyone's got a view on this, and that really it's, you know, it's hard to live a healthy, happy, long life when you're in this sort of powerless situation. So he particularly confirmed that. So he also said that Marxism explains social phenomena as determined by the economic structure of society. And according to Marx, social change can only come around when the economic situation changes. So when people get wealthier, they're able to have more say in things. Um, and when, or if the distribution becomes more even, people will be more involved, really, because along with the economic distribution becoming even, power will be distributed as well. He believed that power and economics went hand in hand. So the concepts of the modern period, social divisions between ownership, non-ownership. So Marxist theory is used to question the naturalness of capitalist relations, and to identify this as fundamentally an exploitive relationship. Okay. I don't know how people disagree with that. So Marxist theory really, unlike symbolic interactionist, which is about individuals, it's a bit more like functionalism, because it's looking at the structure of society, you know, the whole society, really. So it's a tool for an analysis. Okay, so the fourth one we're looking at is feminism. Actually, sorry, we're looking at five different theories today. Feminism. So we've just talked about Marxist theory, and that's been criticised for its almost exclusive emphasis on economic determinants and not really thinking about anything else. But Marx believed the economic determinant was the cause of inequality. The feminists really decided to challenge that, not by totally disagreeing. They sort of agreed in general, but they identified there were other inequalities really brought around by gender issues as well. And and they said they were quite critical of the fact that some of the big drivers, the founding fathers of sociology, really just focused on social class and the division of labour and the role of the state. So the Marxist idea and the functionalist idea. So feminists really wanted to highlight that there was these other inequalities between women and men, and how that affected society as well. And they said that all the previous approaches had ignored some really important elements of society, such as the family and the effect of the family and gender relationships. So, but the first approach really looks at the way industrialization specifically impacted women compared to how it impacted men. And one of the most significant changes for women was the shift of work for remuneration from the home to a separate space, really. So if you think pre-industrialization, a lot of people worked rurally, agriculturally in a lot of countries. And all work was often focused on your locality, just in your village. People didn't travel. They tilled their own land. They looked after their own animals. So it was subsistence living, and then if they made enough money, they sold at market or sold to their neighbours. You very rarely even sold to the other town. Maybe you might do if you had some sort of market, but it's a fairly closed structure. So the family worked together, and their working life was pretty much mixed up with their home life. It worked from their own farm buildings or their cottages, those sorts of things. And then with industrialization, people had to move for work. So it was quite a change, because factories would be developed, but mainly closer to the big cities. So either the whole family moved or the men of the family moved to work, and sort of there was a separation. So that's sort of one transformation. And the other element is about the changes in women's lives as well. The modern era is very associated with the split between the public and private spheres. Um, and it was assumed that the sort of it's natural to study the public world of paid work, because that's where originally all the original studies were. You know, post industrialization, let's see what's happening in the realms of work, what's happening in politics, what's happening with the state. And these were generally, in those days, in the early days of sociology, areas where men were dominant, because it was men who went to work, it was men who held the more important jobs. It was men who acted in politics. It took many years for women to actually get into politics, many years for women to get to vote, let alone get into politics. So it was a very male dominated area, and it was this aspect of the social world, and the whole of society, and the sort of values that were driven by society were driven by the working people, their politics, the government, the state that managed them, the law, and really that was a male dominated area. Women remained in what was known as the private sphere, managing the family, doing unpaid work. The former sphere, the public sphere, was open to change with industrialization, with changes in society, changes in work, changes in technology. There was always social change going on. Whereas some of the sociologists in the early days believed that the private sphere didn't change. Woman was at home with the family, doing the housework, blah, blah, blah. And that was the same in the 1950s as it was in the 1980s. just the fact that they might have had a bit more technology to help them out, like washing machines and things like that. But they didn't see it as major social change. So the result of this sort of split was there was a sort of an acceptance that men and women were different fundamentally, and these differences were natural and could never be altered. So to challenge these assumptions, we saw the development of the feminists really from the late 60s, early 70s onwards. That's really when they came around. And they started to make substantial contribution to understanding the social world and very much also to the study of health and illness as well. And the feminist theory, as I said, by analysing gender relations, identified where a lot of female inequality has been structured. One of their concepts is explaining this inequality is that of patriarchy, and that really means that men rule over women, and older men rule over younger men. So the concept of patriarchy's been very strong in the belief of the sort of feminist idea, and it proves, quite a strong insight into a lot of people's lives. So let's have a look at some feminist research and let's see how we can relate it to health and well-being or health and social care. So Berg's, I looked, 2020 is not too old, feminist perspective in their research with families in Sierra Leone with children who have sickle cell disorder. A sickle cell disorder is a genetic condition that affects blood and result in lifelong health conditions. There can also be episodes that can be acute and can be very life-threatening at times. Otherwise, it's problematic. So it can go from problematic to life-threatening. And they found there was some sort of very clear gendering processes. While the women, all the women were considered to be caregivers in the family, and they used their position to try and counter some of the prevailing gender norms. So in that society, women were often blamed for birth differences or birth defects or failures. So as the main caregivers, they tried to find out all the information about sickle cell so they can make it clear to people that it sort of wasn't their fault, really. And by sharing information, identifying that fathers can also have the genetic trait, once that was found, it really helped to reduce the stigma, because up until that point, it was just believed, again, that it was the mother's fault that someone had sickle cell. There was something wrong with her in that sense. But after a bit of research found out that men could carry the genetic trait, then fathers took more of an active role in the caregiving, and because the stigma was reduced. Women then created spaces in the domestic setting, so they learned how to look after and shield their young person with SCD from the potential risks, and to make sure they survive some of the early childhood problems. There were other associated illnesses. So doing so, there was no particularly different treatment between boys and girls. You weren't treated differently because both were probably slightly over cared for and fussed over, one could say, just to make sure that or monitored carefully. And sometimes they maybe might not have joined in with school activities because of their sickle cell disease, especially when they were quite young. But be all boys or girls, they would have been kept away from it, really. Once the children entered their teens, and they started asserting themselves, and the children had to be going to school at this time. They might have had delayed schooling because of their illness when they were younger, but there was an expectation that they would be attending school, even if they did have some periods of illness. These social genders started reapplying. So young girls, because at that age, people could become pregnant quite early in that society. So they would be talking about it at teenage. So young girls were encouraged to postpone motherhood, or not to be a mother at all, to avoid the risk of giving birth with SCD. So it was like, don't do it really, because you'll only have a sickle cell child. But that attitude was never really enforced with the men. So while a lot of counselling and support and direction was given to the woman, like don't get pregnant, basically, with the men, they were encouraged to carry on and develop relationships and father children, because that was considered, well, that's what men do. You know, that they can't not help themselves. That so it was considered, it was a patriarchal norm that, you know, men's job is to father children. So they would either go and have children with somebody else, or they would carry it. They would have sex with girls, because that's what men are on the earth to do. And it doesn't matter whether we pass on sickle cell or not, because you can't stop me from doing what is my right to do. So you can see that there was a different approach taken. Like, there's no point trying to stop the men, because they're going to do it anyway. But with the women, we can encourage them not to get pregnant. So they sort of made young women sort of take responsibility, but they didn't ask the men to take any responsibility. And what generally happened was, from a very young age, most young women with sickle cell often went on the pill, just in case. So, whereas the men carried on doing whatever it was they were going to do. Okay. So that's a piece of feminist research. Okay, the last one we're looking at is postmodernism, and that refers to the present historical period, and it's characterized by globalization of economy and culture, and also by individual identity fragmenting, so that some of the old certainties of class and gender identity that we've been talking about are called into question. So we're looking at a very modern view here, really, from the last 20 years or so. So it refers to a particular paradigm, and this case is what's being challenged is, you know, our certainty of our knowledge or our beliefs about the world. And it's also challenging the ability of sociological theory to actually come to the truth, or, you know, in other words, it's a way of saying, yeah, these theories are really old and there are other things to think about. And those of you who've got young children or got younger brothers and sisters, or teach younger people, I know a good couple of you teach people, you've come across the teenager who says, yeah, I know that's what you used to think, but it's all different now. We do everything differently now. Everything you learnt was wrong, and we know a whole load of new stuff. So really, that's what postmodernism is. It's basically saying, yes, all those theories were very useful, but they're not all right now. Okay. So the emphasis of this postmodernist approach is not on producing an all-embracing theory, but it's just, you know, identifying the fact that there could be lots of different ways of looking at things. Thinking of postmodernism and medicine, it's about having a much more critical and questioning an approach, which really goes along with the way people's attitudes are. So medical knowledge, an established body of theory, and it's now being challenged by postmodernism. It's been challenged as to whether all medical knowledge is the truth. It's a bit like all science, you know. Science is a fact until we prove it isn't, in a way, because things change. So, you know, when nobody believed in black holes, now they do. So before we said, the world was flat. Now we've proved it's round. It's the same in medical knowledge. This works for this, but every now and then we find something else that we have to move on for. So Foucault said that in order to understand science and medicine, we have to think about them as discourses. Discourses mean sort of conversations about the body and health and natural world, rather than accepting them as, complete realities, which is, great for people who are interested in having conversations and discussions, but a bit difficult when you're going to have your lung disease diagnosed, isn't it? Because you want the doctor to say, it is this, and this is what will treat it. So, okay. So medicine is often described as a dominant discourse. Disease in the body, because Western biomedicine has been accepted, and therefore it's known as a legitimate way. But now people are sort of looking at maybe bringing in some of the, old Eastern ideas, acupuncture, acupressure, herbal medicines, those sorts of things. And people are saying that, okay, the scientific explanation is just one thing, but there are other things. If I do enough yoga, I can make myself weller in that way. So people are challenging the dominance of the medical, and they're questioning what appears to be scientific. So that's postmodernism, really. To summarize, sociology is concerned with the study of society, specifically with key issues such as inequalities. We'll go on to talk about inequalities, the sociology of inequalities in itself in another section. Sociology offers what Bruce terms the scientific method of inquiry, characterized by the search for valid evidence. In that respect, it's the same as all the other sciences, biology, chemistry, physics, in that it takes a research approach. Study of sociology requires us to think outside our own experiences and to employ the sociological imagination. And that's about putting together theories and ideas and then going on to prove them. Sociological theory can be distinguished from everyday theory by its requirement to resort to reasoned evidence and coherence. So, again, scientific. What has emerged is that health is clearly bound up with the social world, with some of the main inequalities and patterns of health and illness can only be explained by reference to sociology. Okay. I put some further reading there for you.